Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Come on, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for those very generous and warm words, Christy, of welcome. And it was just an honor being able to be a fellow with you years ago at the Radcliffe Institute. And in many ways, we had conversations about this project during that time. And during the Q&A, I'm not going to talk so much about Kenya today, but it'll be integrated into my talk. But I should say that one of the things that came out of that Kenya project was the fact that I had clearly stepped into a moment of time, right? That Kenya, it became clear, was not a one-off, was not an exception, but was really part of a much longer history about colonial violence and the end of empire. In other words, I happened to drop into that one moment, 1952 and 1960, the Mau Mau emergency. And so even whilst I was finishing up that book, it was clear that many questions were left unanswered, right? Why so much violence? What was it about Kenya? Was it similar or different? Did it fit into a longer pattern, a longer array of colonial violence at the end of empire? And if so, why hadn't much been written about this, for the most part, particularly from, if you will, the center, the metropole, right? And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Sort of the towering figures who launched the field of British imperial history. And I want to sort of weave a story together for all of you. And I know that you're supposed to be taking copious notes and the rest of it. I'm very old school. I'm up here. I don't have the flashy PowerPoints and the rest of it. I'm kind of a Luddite that way. But also because I want you to listen to me, right? There are several strands that come into this, right? There's a strand about why is it that the field of British imperial history has thought and written about empire in a particular kind of way, right? Ignoring in some ways the vast evidence about colonial violence. What is it about the British Empire that's similar or different from others? What is it about liberalism in empire, right? What is it about the liberal agenda that can allow for ideas of progress and equality, the rule of law, with this underbelly that I certainly saw in Kenya, and over the last 10 years, I'm like, where's Waldo on the former British imperial map? Israel, Palestine, Malaysia, Singapore, Cyprus, and Northern Ireland, Zimbabwe, all over doing research, right? And then what happens if you take sort of a look at one particular thing? I want to talk about the nature of interrogation, the nature of MI5, the nature of the idea of the circulation of ideas and people around the empire. And within, I think, 45 minutes or less, try to tie it all together for you. So I'm not sure I'll hold it 45 minutes, and I hope I'll tie it all together. But when the towering figure, a man named John Gallagher, stood in front of Oxford audience in 1974 to deliver his distinguished board lectures, much like today's lecture, but packed with the audience, the legendary historian of the British Empire made the case for an imperial resurgence in the aftermath of the Allied victory. A result of the Second World War was temporarily to reintegrate the British world system, Gallagher said, reversing the trend and turning it back from influence towards empire before the downfall. Gallagher's case for imperial resurgence after the war was very much in the spirit of high politics, with really a total disavowal of freedom fighters or the influence of nationalist movements. It was all about Britain, right? Next to no fighting occurred, he said, quote, and ultimately decolonization was more, as he says, quote, a refusal to play the game any longer. There's no hint in Gallagher's lectures of the drama that unfolded, like I was just described in Kenya, in the remote corners of British Empire in the final days, of the messiness of Britain's departures, of the freedom fighters, or local elites facilitating violence on all sides of the imperial divide, or of course of the plumes of ashes erupting from empires burning archives as the British from place to place in their waning days of decolonization burn the evidence consistently. Now historians of empire have had a very particular and powerful role to play in how the British public and politicians viewed and shaped the world. Save for a few marginalized radical thinkers, often called radicals, and I'm very pleased to say that I am called a radical by all of these guys. It's a compliment, guys, really it is. Save for these radicals, British imperial historians ordered their narratives to really conform to a dominant worldview. And they really offered explicit ideological defenses of the ongoing British endeavors throughout the colonized world. For decades, Anglo-Saxon trusteeship and the fairness, if not the humility with which the white man's burden brought humanity and civilization to the lesser races of the world was basically the watermark that ran through every single page on the history of the British Empire. The jingoistic roots of such historical accounts really can be found in the imperial project itself. At the turn of the century, beneficiaries of the South African War began funding chairs for imperial history, the Bite Chair, right, in colonial history at Oxford, the Bear of Armsworth Chair of Imperial History and Naval History at Cambridge, and so on. And in time, a sort of unholy ideological alliance was formed between Britain's hallowed centers of learning, Oxford, Cambridge, and King's College London. And collectively, they have been known as the Golden Triangle. Now, towering historians, John Sealing and the first two occupiers of the Bite Chair, Egerton and Copeland, hooked the wagon of the empire to the Whig narrative of the nation, or the idea that British history writ large was the story of progress, and with it the expansion of liberty throughout Britain and, of course, eventually the entire world. The liberal outlook generated a progressive theory of history and the experience of empire itself, together with these emerging ideas of social Darwinism, right? The idea that humanity is organized according to the whitest of the white, the British at the top, all the way down to the blackest of black in Africa, that somehow or another, that this was the underwriting of the notion that fueled these histories. And ultimately, for the Golden Triangle historians, the essence of British imperial rule was a spread of constitutional freedom, and with it, the deployment of power using free labor instead of slavery, and a system of governance that was based on the rule of law, absence of despotism, and the like. Now, implicit in all of this, in all of these histories of the British Empire, was an abject denial of the role of violence in imperial expansion. Coercion and terror were either absent from liberalism's hagiography of empire, or it was minimized and explained away. Then, there was a dramatic turn in the field. It was somewhat complicated, the shift in historical perspective that took place in the Golden Triangle after the Second World War. Now, at the time, the future of Britain's empire was rather uncertain. A point I'll get back to you in a moment. And within this context, the Golden Triangle historians really had a hard time in offering these kind of explicit moral claims about empire. So what did they do about this? Well, instead, Robin Robinson and John Gallagher, again, the same Gallagher who's giving these lectures, offered new interpretations of Britain's past. And it's centered on the official mind of imperial expansion and retreat. And together with their extraordinary cohort of students, Robinson and Gallagher asked questions that looked at the multiple levels of governance and politics and the interplay of elites and others at home. And in some ways, Britain was no longer the hero of the story, but it wasn't the villain either, right? As Richard Drayton has pointed out, this sort of post-1950 anti-ideological moment was in itself a kind of ideological position, right? When you think about it. Robinson and Gallagher's school of imperial history avoided the terrain of moral claims. But to do so, it turned its head away from the ugly business of empire, leaving unasked and therefore unanswered questions about colonial violence, racism, and exploitation. And moreover, these historians spurned the claims of nationalist movements throughout the empire, minimizing their intentions and their effects. In other words, they had no place in the narrative. My Mau Mau adherents were not part of their story. And it was the perfect form of imperial history for a British nation no longer so confident in its imperial role. And as Drayton presciently suggests, the school equally allowed Britain and the nation to escape the scene of the crime. Now, for Robinson and Gallagher and their descendants, the neutrality, if not the sanctity, of the British official archive was crucial to their story. In other words, written documents were everything. And they were the only form of trusted evidence. And a point that I'm going to come back to. And so therefore what happens is it's the power of the archive, what's in there, really shaped the ways in which the future understood the British imperial past for decades. It ignored the point that I just made, the massive burning of archives at the end of empire. The absences, for somebody who does, on an archival route, you could drive a truck through the gaping holes that are in not just the colonial archives, in the periphery, places like Nairobi and Kuala Lumpur and Singapore and Tel Aviv, but also in the National Archives in London itself. In other words, the culling that took place on a massive scale was not just in the periphery, but it was at home. Now, importantly, the historical profession, with all its claims to neutrality, right? That's what historians do. We're very dispassionate. We don't have any opinion. I missed that memo somewhere. Now, this historical profession has been deeply implicated in the reproduction of these archival realities, and with it, the British government's end of empire fiction, so carefully created and honed all the way down to the present day. Does that make sense? Now, while the 1950s were a decade of crises, I'll give you a few of them. Suez, the drawn-out counter-insurgency in different parts of the empire, forceful interventions in Iran and British Guiana, and the 1960s and 70s scarcely an improvement, with continued counterinsurgencies and the euphemistically termed troubles of Northern Ireland. Now, scarce attention was paid to any of these crises in any kind of in-depth or integrative way when chronicling Britain's imperial decline after 1945. Instead, the end of empire is really portrayed as a variety of things, but really it falls into two camps. A kind of natural progression towards self-governance in the aftermath of the Second World War, or a kind of uncoordinated misadventure. I like this one. That's a British term, right? A misadventure. Occurring in a fit of absent-mindedness with little to no thought about the consequence of imperial divestiture, nor much despondency in Britain over the loss of the nation's colonial possessions. Now, there have been more recent attempts in the last few years at rewriting the history of the end of the British Empire while making up ground on detailing some of the British uses of violence and coercion. I don't want you to sort of leave here thinking that nobody's written about this before. But they've similarly fallen short in their analytical and explanatory approaches. Now, why is that? Well, like their Golden Triangle predecessors, these histories, among other things, fail to venture outside Britain's archives. In other words, they're all done from the center, right? You can sort of trace them, and if you go back to all their sources, you can find it. They overstate the significance, extremely, of newly released documents, which I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A, and they range from being mildly dismissive to outright hostile in the use of non-textual sources, particularly oral interviews from non-Europeans. And I underscore that point. Now, consequently, many of these accounts at the end of the British Empire overlook the contradictory tendency of liberalism to produce at once a dominant narrative of progress towards human emancipation, equality, rights, and the civilizing mission, alongside the suppressed underside of oppression as witnessed in evolutionary thought, racism, coercion, class, sexism, among other things. And it's these contradictions in the liberal project that underwrite the extreme levels of violence and coercion at the end of the British Empire. And it's these same contradictions that render liberalism and its relationship to imperialism so pernicious. In other words, what I'm saying is that they're two sides of the same coin, right? The story, and I'm going to explain this more in a moment, the story of progress, of extending the rule of law, of bringing ideas of civilization. The other side of that is the underbelly, exploitation, coercion, racism. And you're going to get, when you get one, you're going to get the other. Now, I'm also not here to say that I'm the first to come up with this. There's a huge school of thought. Post-colonial critique, we've got one of the foremost gentlemen sitting in our room who has written in different ways and in a literary way about this. Marxism, subaltern scholars, in other words, scholars, many of whom have come from India. Where are they within the narrative about end of the British Empire? About these dominant historiographical trends that emanate from this holy golden triangle? Really nowhere. It's as if this entire historiography or this entire kind of theoretical literature has been ignored. Now, I want to step back for a second and talk a little bit more about this idea of liberalism. Because Britain's civilizing mission of the 19th and 20th centuries was, in theory, a departure from the old forms of conquest and colonization, embedded as it was in European Enlightenment and its claims to universal principles as the basis for political, economic, and social inclusion. Yet the applicability of these universal principles was fiercely contested, no more so than in the context of empire. In the case of Britain, a reformist impulse justified the creation of colonial categories that facilitated racial and cultural exclusions and dominations. Put another way, as ideas of universal citizenship emerged, so too did contestations over who was capable of embracing notions of rationality in social and economic progress, and therefore entitled to the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. In other words, these great thinkers weren't so sure that everybody was entitled to the rights and responsibilities of international citizenship, right? And think about what I said about how this is eventually coalesces or merges with notions of social Darwinism. Over time, a progressive notion of citizenship emerged that was intimately bound with Britain's civilizing mission. It was Britain's duty, morally, economically, culturally, to tutor the uncivilized world of Africa, Asia, yes, Ireland, and other parts of the empire. And importantly, the so-called despotic and barbarous status of colonial subjects was an historical phenomenon as opposed to something immutable or innate. Looked at another way, the civilizing mission and with it the benefits of liberalism citizenship was bound into a narrative of human development. Some of Britain's most distinguished liberal thinkers, James Mill, Thomas Macaulay, Charles Trevelyan, John Stuart Mill, all uniformly endowed the so-called natives of empire with childlike qualities and juxtaposed them with the paternalistic images of the British and their imperial civilizing mission. And it was J.S. Mill, though, who articulated the most vigorous and I would suggest well-developed defense of liberalism's relationship to 19th century and eventually 20th century imperialism. In his writings, he didn't equivocate with regard to Britain's political ascendancy over its subject populations, saying, quote, "The same rules of international morality do not apply between civilized nations and between nations and barbarians." Ultimately, for J.S. Mill, England had a right, if not duty, to rule despotically to bring progress to the barbarous populations of the world. And as Britain's protean imperial reach extended throughout the 19th century, so did its liberal vision begin to consolidate. Liberalism was, at once, activist and reformist. And it was not, however, without its critics, and J.S. Mill was hardly left unscathed. Edmund Burke, in particular, cut to the heart of liberalism's contradictions, some of which I'm teasing out here for you today, when he inverted the childlike metaphor that was cast about empire. Because for Burke, it was the British colonial officials and their premature power that were the stuff of children. In their writings, Burke and others parsed the inherent paradoxes of a liberal project and empire, and they wrote of liberal imperialism's possible descent into one form of despotic rule, while theoretically reforming another in the far-flung corners of the empire. Moreover, in these same minds, particularly Burke's, he was concerned not only with liberalism's move towards despotism abroad, but he was also concerned with the possibilities of undemocratic forms of governance returning back to the metropole, to London, right? Now, when looked at historically, imperialist expansion was inherent to liberalism's ideology of universalist notions of progress, the extension of capitalism and moral claims. And this expansionist quality was, when necessary, heavy-handed, if not outright violent, in its imposition and execution. Importantly, absent of its reformist impulse, violence was, in fact, condemned in the late 19th century European empires, and the case of King Leopold in the Congo would be a very good example of this, right? But as 20th century empires matured in places like Africa and Asia, the ways in which colonial regimes constructed and defined categories such as tribe and caste, together with notions of race and gender and class, and notions that would allied, as we'll see, over time in the post-war era, allied into notions about terrorists, savages, irreconcilable, bandits, right? All of these categories created a praxis through which liberalism could increasingly justify its use of oppressive laws and intensifying violence, right? In other words, my point here is that European empires wouldn't put up with somebody like King Leopold because there's no justification in moral claims about civilizing missions or progress. And when you think about it, these creations of categories where they a priori suggest a kind of inferiority along the scale of civilization, provide a praxis, a justification for the kinds of what becomes increasingly violent forms of colonial rule, right? And of course, all of you, I suspect, have heard, and particularly those concerned with human rights law, about the ways in which discourse, things like how ideas about race allied into ideas about barbarism, allied into terminology, savage, terrorist, bandit, which then provides a justification for increasing violence. Now, the aggression that accompanied Britain's imperial resurgence in the aftermath of the Second World War certainly defies Gallagher's claim that next to no fighting occurred in the waning days of the British Empire. Instead, the post-World War II era ushered in similarities in counterinsurgency and interrogation techniques with a proliferation of undemocratic institutions and laws in colonies throughout the empire. This becomes evident when analyzing the circular impact of ideas and practices, as well as individuals within the British Empire and between the metropolitan area of London and Britain and the colonies itself. And so in other words, I'm going to make the argument that part of the way in which we can begin tracing how this phenomenon occurs, how there's a long array of colonial violence culminating in the post-World War II area, is to start tracing the individuals and ideas that moved through the empire over this long 20th century, right? Now, to varying degrees, binding together these myriad actors on the colonial landscape, whether they were in the military, colonial service, Secret Service, it was MI5, not MI6, that was out in the empire, or settler populations, was an internalization of liberalism. That there was something about this, and I don't want to overstate this claim, right? Also, individuals come with their own ideas, but there's a very pernicious form of liberalism and its imperial forms that provides a kind of logic and rationale for the violence. And you see this time and again, not just in actions and behaviors, but in memoirs, the ways in which language is used in documents, the ways in which the civilizing mission becomes articulated in various forms by a whole host of different actors in the empire. Now, looked at closely, a reconsideration of Britain and its empire gestures toward, as I said, a long array of British colonial violence in the 20th century. And it's one that's characterized by, again, the circularity of individuals and ideas and institutions moving between the British Empire and the metropole and back out again to the empire before and after the Second World War in particular. Various individuals, whether they were attached to different colonial governments, British military, the police force, the Secret Service, at times moved throughout the empire like spokes on a wheel. Returning to London, say they went out to Kenya, they came back to London, and then they went out to Malaya, right? And at other times, they moved along sort of the outer run of empire, never going back into the metropole. So sometimes individuals, even in my own work, were dispatched out to Palestine. When the state of emergency was over in Palestine, they went to Malaya. When it was done in Malaya, they went to Kenya. When it was done in Kenya, they went to Cyprus, right? Now, unquestionably, the acceptability of British colonial violence shifted over time and space, giving rise to different forms of coercion, as well as renewed efforts to legitimize them through sets of legal codes that were, in fact, incubated in empire, picked up in the metropole during the Second World War, and then reformulated and exported back out to the empire. Now, what do I mean by this? In the empire, in India, and in Ireland in particular, there were various kinds of emergency regulations that allow for the suspension of all kinds of civil liberties. They become later on the basis for states of emergency and police states. These ideas in empire, much to Burke's concern, are imported into the metropole. First during the First World War, and particularly in a much greater scale in the Second World War in the form of the Defense of the Realm Acts. And these are full-scale suspension of civil liberties during the war. After the war, these Defense of the Realm Acts are then done. What happens? They go back out into the empire, are expanded upon, and become further legal code for what becomes 139, 157 pages of emergency regulations, right? So you can see it's not just movement of individuals, it's movement ideas and practices. And you can trace this, and I'm giving you a few examples to a variety of different ways. One of which I can give you, I figured I'd really bore you to tears if I gave you the genealogy of legal legislation here. So trust me, it's there. Now, and as I said, so it's this despotism that liberal thinkers like Burke so strongly caution against, not only unfolded in the early years of the 20th century in places like India and Ireland, but it returned home during the Second World War before finding its way back to empire through the movement of ideas and institutions as well as individuals. And I'm a historian, and historians are all about, first of all about change over time. Without that, we're out of a job. But I'm also about, I'm giving you all the structure, but it's also about individuals. And so what happens when individuals like, and I love these names, Tin-Eye Stevens and Alexander Scotland and their coterie of colonial-bred wartime interrogators who form the backbone of MI5, what happens if we look at them and try to trace their movements back and forth with empire? And what can that tell us? Well, to understand Tin-Eye and Scotland and their band of, for lack of better terms, merry interrogators, a far more expansive, integrative, and critical reading of the MI5 and colonial office files more generally is necessary. The British government has, as I've mentioned, carefully managed the release, particularly of its Secret Service records, co-opting official historians. There's some wonderful histories about MI5 written by Christopher Andrews, who's the official historian. They do that. They co-opt an official historian. They give them access to all the files. They can only write so much, and then an official history is produced. I've never been an official historian. That was funny, guys. And of course, the government is notorious for providing relatively meaningless document dumps as a form of good faith distraction to historians and the general public. Kind of like what happens in the United States with the Kennedy era. About every 5 years, we'll get some new documents on the grassy knoll. It'll make everybody very excited. They get all worked up. There's really nothing there, and then the cycle repeats itself. Now, in our context, the silences in the official archives, along with the processes of document destruction in the former colonies, must be read alongside written and oral archives in the former empire itself. Methodologically, this is fundamental to linking the interrelatedness, as I'm talking about, of Britain's intelligence service and the circulation of individual ideas and tactics to this broader project of imperial resurgence that's happening in the aftermath of the Second World War and in the context of the emerging Cold War. Now, examining the circulation of these ideas and individuals through this lens of MI5 provides, I would say, one window into not only the violence at the end of empire, but also the ways in which liberalism took form in shifting landscapes in the post-World War II era. Importantly, from the top of its hierarchy down to its agents on the ground, MI5, you guys all know what you've seen James Bond, right? Okay, that's MI5. MI5 was very much a product of empire. And I want you to hold on to this. And let me just give you a few examples. The first Director General of MI5, Vernon Cow, recruited MI5 candidates exclusively from a circle of friends and family whom he knew, with the majority of his recruits coming from postings in India and other British colonies. Cow's successor, first David Petrie and later Percy Sillitoe, also served in the empire as the head of the intelligence branch in Delhi and the British South African Police Force, respectively. Together, they continued the colonial old boy recruiting practices for Britain's Secret Service, as did several of the other directors that followed. In other words, they were recruiting directly out of people who had experience in empire. It was hardly surprising then that MI5 colleagues were connected not only through sensibilities and shared experiences of colonial rule and pastimes, but also through a culture of empire that reflected the contradictions of the local project abroad, and increasingly at home. Moreover, during the end of empire era, MI5 created an intelligence web across the globe that reflected, at least in part, Britain's broader economic, strategic, and Cold War interests, which very much intersect with empire. In the aftermath, and I'll give you sort of a few things, sort of a basis for contextualization. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Britain was fiscally bankrupt and depended upon the United States for an economic bailout, as well as loans for post-war rebuilding efforts. And Britain looked to its empire time and again. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the Attlee Labour government or the successive Conservative Tory governments. Over and again, they looked to the vast empire with its potential economic value as a solution to the financial crisis, right? And a way to get out from under the fiscal thumb and control of the Americans. So suddenly, the oil fields of the Middle East, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the cocoa plantations in the Gold Coast, all begin to take on heightened significance. And suddenly we start moving from a discourse of progress and from progress to one of development and modernization, right? They're looking to basically pump money out of the colonies to service all this wartime debt. And of course, the political and strategic value of Britain's empire was also not to be underestimated, particularly in a realigned post-World War of East versus West. Despite its enfeebled position after the war, Britain really desperately tried to stake its claim as one of the big three. One of the three great powers at the dawn of the Cold War, or at least the strongest of the world's middle powers. Ruler of an empire that still extended over vast swaths of territory, Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific, London legitimately remained one of the more powerful players on the international scene. And moreover, as relations increasingly deteriorated between East and West after 1945, the strategic value of colonial territories such as Singapore, Aden, Mombasa, places in Cyprus and elsewhere, only grew. Now, the Cold War also changed the rules of the game and American policy, at least nominally anti-imperialist, which was much more willing to tolerate and even support continuing British empire in the face of rising communist threat. In other words, when asked to decide between self-determination and defending itself against real and perceived communist threat, the Americans were willing to look the other way. Such views placed Britain, and the United States for that matter, in precarious ideological and political positions with regard to post-war human rights accords and their connection to self-determination. Yet in many ways, this ideological thrust behind Britain's approach to human rights accords, self-determination, and their empire reflect the kinds of contradictions that we see harkening all the way back to John Stuart Mill, right? This is nothing new. And they were quite articulate at Dumbarton Oaks, for example, when discussing human rights accords, that these accords, quote unquote, do not apply to our colonies, said one of the foreign office officials there. They were quite unambiguous about this. Now, if we then look at intelligence gathering, we can see the tactics honed during the Second World War, Britain's commitment to imperial resurgence, and Cold War imperatives all converging together, right? Now, what do I mean by this? Well, first in turn, they led to the creation of police states in each counterinsurgency location. In other words, everywhere that you go, Palestine, Malaya, Kenya, states of emergencies are declared. And insofar as there were civil liberties, they're all suspended. Now, there was also the deployment of individuals and practices that embraced various uses of torture and violence as a means through which to gather intelligence. And there was certainly and decidedly, and I'll say it quite clearly here, the belief that this worked, that this produced usable intelligence. We know, and I'm happy to have a really long argument if anybody disagrees with me about this, it doesn't work, right? But they certainly believed that it did. Now, take, for example, and I'm going to give you a few of those to sort of trace this. Take, for example, the role of MI5 in the establishment of Camp 020 and the London Cage during the Second World War, as well as the combined service detailed interrogation centers that are known as SISDICs and the post-war area. Okay. Now, Camp 020 was the domain of Lieutenant Colonel Tin-Eye Stevens. You can't make this guy up, right? Styled as such because of the monocle he had permanently affixed to his right eye, Tin-Eye was a typical MI5 recruit, having cut his teeth in empire. Tin-Eye and his MI5 compatriots would have crucial roles to play in establishing interrogation centers, first in Britain, in London, during the Second World War, and later in continental Europe and in the Empire. In time, interrogation centers would dot Britain's landscape, with the two most notorious being the London Cage and Camp 020. Located, as I said, in the nation's capital, where their eavesdropping systems combined with heavy-handed tactics to produce what were seen as extraordinarily effective albeit morally and legally questionable, systems of intelligence gathering. Now, Stevens, Tinai, personally oversaw all detainees and the quote-unquote special methods of interrogation at the MI5 Center, or Camp 020, and was accountable to really three people. Guy Liddell and Dick White, who were the number 1 and 2 in command at MI5's B Division, overseeing all this, and Winston Churchill, and his security executive. And on this security executive was a who's who list of all the people involved with suspicious forms of violence and interrogation in Britain's empire, including Kenneth Diplock, who becomes infamous, of course, for the Diplock courts in Northern Ireland. Now, the War Office worked closely with MI5 in establishing sort of London's secret interrogation centers. Nobody knows this is going on, right? And certainly nobody outside this inner circle of people. Now, Stevens Camp 020 was located at Notchmere House. And the reason they don't know where it's going on is listen to where these places are. It's a Victorian mansion in pastoral western suburb of London near Ham Common. The other, known as the London Cage, was located in Kensington Palace Gardens, the posh and exclusive section of London renowned today for its stately mansions and dot-com billionaires. Now, of course, both of these were staffed with a phalanx of interrogators and clerks, many of whom were military, who had experience in the empire, and others who were German and Austrian nationals who were working on behalf of the British government. Now, the commander of the London Cage, this one that's located in posh Kensington, was a man named Alexander Scotland. Now, a one-time military intelligence officer, Scotland was brought out of retirement specifically for his interrogation services and the running of the cage at Kensington Palace Gardens. Now, what's interesting about Scotland is that Scotland cut his teeth in empire, but he just missed out on the South African War. He was very disappointed not to have been able to participate in the concentration camps where tens of thousands of Afrikaner women and children and Africans died. So he then decides to change his name to Alexander Schuckland and join the German army. And he joins the German army and he engages so that he can go to Southwest Africa where the German military is involved in a genocidal campaign against the Herero. Great, as far as he's concerned. Problem is he gets picked up by the Germans as a British spy, which of course he's not, but they think he is. And they torture the heck out of the guy. And it's from that in all of his writings, he's a prolific writer, which I'll refer to in a moment. In all of his writings, he talks about some of the most important techniques that he picked up were actually from the Germans. And of course, much of, as many of you may know, many of the, and it's written by people like Hannah Arendt and Origins of Totalitarianism, talk about the fact that these campaigns for the South African War, but in particular, the German campaign in Southwest Africa provide much of the basis for, and Hitler actually in the 1920s when he's in prison, reads many of the accounts that happened during the Herero genocide and builds upon this. So this is where Scotland is sending himself. And not surprisingly, in time, Scotland's London Cage and Stevens Camp 020 become the subjects of scrutiny when several prisoners allege torture and other cruelties and neighbors start hearing the screams. Now, in the case of Camp 020, several torture techniques were devised with an eye, interestingly enough, to plausible deniability and thus seeking to leave few marks. And so this includes starvation tactics, sleep deprivation, threats of hanging and death by firing squads. Now, in the case of the London Cage, allegations of mistreatment came really from several former prisoners, and Scotland readily admitted to various psychological techniques and acts of humiliation, though denied routinely, at least publicly, the use of any physical torture, despite extensive corroborating evidence from former prisoners, and the fact, as I alluded to a moment ago, that Scotland himself would later pen a manuscript on the London Cage in 1954, which, prior to the government's heavy censoring, contained methods of interrogation that would cause, I quote, considerable embarrassment to Her Majesty's government, according to the Foreign Office. MI5's legal advisor was clear that if published Stevens' account without serious redactions, Britain would be open to legitimate charges of breaching the Geneva Convention. Okay. Now, the significance of all of this, Tinai, Stevens, Scotland, and Camp 020 and the London Cage, are really profound when reading the landscape of intelligence during the era of imperial resurgence in the Cold War. Tinai would move to the infamous Syzdek Interrogation Center in Bad Nadendorf, Germany, where he and several of his underlings, also from Empire and also individuals who were going to be re-exported back to interrogation centers in the Empire, would bring their interrogation methods to bear on Nazi war criminals. Eventually, their methods became the subject of a full court of inquiry investigation headed by Tom Hayward. And in Hayward's final report, nearly 130 pages in all, and it makes for gruesome reading, provided extensive evidence of abuse and torture at Bad Nadendorf at the hands of MI5 representatives. Nonetheless, not one up the chain of command was held accountable for the crimes committed there, which included gross torture and murder. Bottom line, the techniques honed at Camp 020 and Bad Nadendorf and elsewhere were considered to be too good to be given up and too dangerous politically to be revealed. In fact, all details of wrongdoing were kept from the public for decades. And again, when I say kept from the public for decades, there were newspaper accounts of this, just like the case of Kenya, just like Malaya. Some of this is happening in plain view. But getting back in part to my point about the academies, the Golden Triangle. If they're not official documents documenting this, it didn't happen, right? Now, multiple interrogation centers, like Camp 020 and that at Bad Nadendorf, soon mushroomed all over the empire and other spheres of British influence. Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Greece, India, and various parts of North and East Africa, among other places. Syzdeks, as they were called, soon became the sites for Cold War and end of empire intelligence gathering, which were, according to a War Office report, the continuity of personnel and wartime lessons learned have obvious value to the empire. Later, these methods, as well as the interrogation structures necessary to facilitate their implementation, were expanded to various parts of the empire, including places like Palestine, Kenya, Malaya, and Cyprus, where Britain waged counterinsurgencies. In other words, these sites were set up all over, and as these insurgencies arose, they sent more and more individuals to expand methods there. And of course, this is a 30,000 foot view. In each place, kinds of techniques, everything's going to evolve with local circumstances. Conceptions of race, conceptions of the other, right? But there's a thread that we can draw through all of this. In Malaya, for example, Jack Morton of MI5 took the lead on streamlining intelligence gathering and introducing what were becoming widespread British interrogation practices. In addition, there were MI5 troubleshooters like John Prendergast, who passed through nearly every major counterinsurgency operation after the Second World War. The official archive, however, tells us little of what Prendergast did, and the fact that he was even there. And instead, in the case of, let's take the example of Prendergast. So you have this guy that's moving from place to place, and you can sort of see footprints of this in the official archives. He'll come up here and he'll come up there. And the way in which we're divided academically, even in area studies, we have Africans and South Asians and Latin Americans, so that's not quite as appropriate here. And we tend to look at the files that matter to us in our individual areas of study, right? And what it means is that you're not looking, there's no, the cross-cutting nature with which you have to look at this. And then it's like finding a needle in the haystack. There's no search, mechanism online to say, I'm going to type in Prendergast and see how many times he pops up in the British National Archives. You have to go through by hand with each one of these. So Prendergast starts appearing. He's appearing in the National Archives. I see him in Tel Aviv. I see him in archives in Kuala Lumpur. I see him in Singapore. But nobody's telling me a whole lot in these official archives of who this guy is and what he's doing. But when you go to places like the former colonies like Cyprus, oral testimonies, and locally produced histories, published only in Greek. Fortunately, I had some Greek Cypriot translators back at Harvard, who linked Prendergast very decidedly, and others, to the infamous Ormafita police station and the Lefka interrogation cell. Similarly, other kinds of methods then trace him moving through, or previously to that, through Kenya and later on through Aden. In these locations, electric shock, water torture, toe and fingernail removal, and the hanging until near death were part of the larger arsenal of abuse that bore striking similarities to the tortures deployed, as I said, in MI5 and colonial administration special branch sites elsewhere in the empire, such as the Mau Mau Investigation Center in Embakasi in Kenya, and of course bore striking similarities to the kinds of tortures that were taking place in, eventually when the files came out, the reports in Camp 020 in the London cage, and in the CISDEC in Bad Nuremberg in Germany. In other words, we can draw a line, guys, through all of this. Right? Now, in the remaining few minutes, what can we say about all this? Well, in the aftermath of the Second World War, and in the face of real and perceived communist threats, imperial intelligence services and the circularity of ideas, peoples, and tactics are of enormous importance to the end of empire story. So too is the fact that the intelligence services, ostensibly on the front lines of right-to defense, were overwhelmed. They were completely overwhelmed. They were understaffed, they lacked local language knowledge, and really any sense of overall coordination, either within the colony or between the metropole and the colony, at least until MI5 scrambled to reform colonial services throughout the empire in the era of post-war imperial resurgence, and redeployed intelligence officers, particularly from the metropole, back out again. In other words, this surge, this wave, first of the genuine fear of the rise of the Soviet ascendancy, together with wave after wave of these anti-colonial movements. At the same time, there's no avoiding the fact that MI5 was stretched thinly across the globe and consistently misread, I would argue, the insurgent landscape, whether in Palestine, Malaya, Kenya, or elsewhere. Time and again, counter-insurgencies throughout the empire persisted for years and were notable for their lack of effective intelligence gathering. It's in part why these insurgencies went on forever and really defies and flies in the face of the idea that the kinds of tactics that were being used were at all effective, right? And there was also this absolute fixation on potential Soviet threats. There was little understanding of nationalism outside of communism. Nationalism was, time and again, coded in East versus West, which in turn influenced the nature of intelligence gathering, as well as the analyses of intelligence from insurgents and their supporters. And in fact, the Cold War hung over the counterinsurgency operations, particularly intelligence gathering. And this, in turn, influenced the ways in which counterinsurgencies were coded and understood. And I should underscore, very few of these counterinsurgencies were communist at all. Malaya was the big one. They hoped for a very long time. They tried their best, to halfway through the insurgencies in places like Malaya and elsewhere, did they figure out that these were not, in fact, communist. Now, related to this was MI5's underappreciation of local circumstances. And in some ways, this links us back to the earlier ideas I talked about with liberalism. Like their brethren in the various special branches, MI5 representatives, many of whom, as I said, had imperial experience prior to joining the intelligence service, internalized a particular ethos about colonized populations. And you see this. Many of them go ahead, some of them write memoirs quite curiously. Percy Silico, the head of MI5, and a few others. An ethos that was steeped in liberalism's civilizing mission. Western hubris and a very racist outlook in different contexts. And in fact, there was scarcely consideration for the legitimacy of insurgent demands. Many of whom supported, nor of the depth of anti-colonial sentiments felt by the grassroots civilian populations, many of whom supported the insurgents in Palestine, Malaya, Kenya, and elsewhere as a so-called passive wing. In other words, there's a full denial of the fact that people actually had independent ideas and wanted to be, had anti-colonial movements, that these were complex. There were often civil wars. But they simply dismissed these and were looking for something else, particularly communism. Nor was, and I should pause here, I think the other point that strikes me as well is that not only were they not entitled to the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, they weren't even entitled to the rights and responsibilities of basically being free agents, independent thinkers, right? Now, nor was there an appreciation of the ways in which, and I emphasize this, the ways in which colonial governments and MI5 representatives fueled civil wars in the waning days of empire and left them behind as part of their legacies. Thus, even when intelligence structures were more fully established, liberalism's failure to appreciate the situation based upon broader notions of race and British imperial endeavors really precluded a useful collection and assessment of intelligence in the empire and beyond. As I mentioned, categories of side and race quickly gave way to these new categories: bandits, terrorists, savages, and irreconcilables. And not surprisingly, many operations and methods of intelligence gathering only worsened the insurgencies and anti-colonial sentiments, and led to a dependence on brutal interrogation forms that often brought absolutely useless information. Ultimately, the post-World War II era ushered in a period of imperial resurgence, though it looked very, very different from the one I described in my opening remarks in the lecture that John Gallagher imagined. It was an era whereby the relationship between liberalism, state governance, and colonialism was thrown into relief with post-war measures aimed at maximizing imperial revenue, while at the same time minimizing the demands from colonized populations for increased access to freedoms and rights, some of which had been at the heart of the Atlantic Charter, and others subsequently embodied in the Universal Human Rights Accords. Increasingly, modern European liberalism coexisted with modern industrial capitalism in the empire, providing a kind of contradictory impulse toward equality and liberal democracy at home and exploitation and dependency in the colonies. This uneasy coexistence came to a head when multiple end-of-empire wars that were so notable for the minimizing of colonial exploitations and indigenous demands for rights, as they were for the deployment and dependence upon various forms of violence throughout the empire. And violence that took the form of brutal interrogation tactics and colonial coercion, including detention without trial, extrajudicial legal capital punishments, wholesale movements of hundreds of thousands of civilian populations into emergency villages. We saw that happen in Kenya and Malaya. Eventually becomes the basis for strategic hamlet in Vietnam, the American Empire, forced labor, and of course the wide use of various forms of torture to gather intelligence. And I would say that violence to varying degrees was an epiphenomenon that accompanied the collapse of various empires, Britain included. Yet in the case of Britain, there was a particular malignant relationship between liberalism, state governance, and colonialism that resulted in the deployment of weapons and tactics from the Second World War to various corners of the empire, followed by a carefully choreographed policy of destroying and removing official evidence, censoring private publications such as memoirs like that of Scotland and official interviews from former colonial officers and members of the British military, among others. For years, you could interview these guys. Official secrets act, they couldn't talk. The putatively transparent archives in London, however, can no longer tell us anywhere near the complete story of statecraft at the end of the British Empire, as much as they failed to illuminate the scope, scale, and causes of British colonial violence. The question then becomes, to what degrees were policies of state-directed violence coming from the center, and to what degrees were they the result of rogue operators or fearless or authoritarian colonial governments located in the country? And for many years, that's how this was described. Bad apples, one-off. Scotland's, the Tin Eye Stevens, the rogue operators that I indicated, that explained it. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here from one particular lens, and I could have given you several, as I said, I could bore you to tears with or more so than I have, with the legal code, is how to say, wait a minute, how do we look at this in a systematized way? And by doing that, by cutting it across this way, the rogue operators, the bad apples, the one-offs, don't make as much sense. Well, the question is whether directed and systematized violence from the center was it a phenomenon of empire's outpost, or how did violence at the end of empire reflect the broader paradoxes of the liberal project and its mutual constitution with imperialism? And more broadly, several factors, I think, to answer these questions, other than the ones that I do, MI5 was my case study, really have to be integrated into the end of empire story, right? And these included, as I've suggested today, the ideological basis, this mutually constitutive relationship between imperialism and liberalism that drove ideological justifications and actions in the empire and underwrote in various ways this phenomenon that I opened with, and which I'm closing with. The Golden Triangle is a historiography on the British Empire, which denied the role of violence entirely up until the Second World War, and then turned its head away from the scenes of the crime. They also include the ways in which the paradoxes of liberal imperialism, the shifting global landscape of the 20th century, reimagined justifications of violence and strengthened the interconnectedness of oppressive measures between various British colonies and the metropole, both before, during, and after the Second World War. And I'll end on this point, right? And I mentioned it a moment ago. Depending on where you come down in political science, one of the great thinkers, Hannah Arendt. talks about the origins of totalitarianism. And as I mentioned, the incubation of the ideas of various sort of fascist rule in places like British South Africa during the Boer War, the Germans in Southwest Africa. And the idea, as she saw in this, the roots to the Second World War, the roots of fascism. But one of the things that strikes me is, and I have my contention with the rent, which we'll talk about another time. But what's interesting, it's called the boomerang thesis, right? That it's going back into metropolitan Europe. But one thing that I've gestured to today, and one thing that we haven't thought about as a field, is what happens when all of these forms, you call them what you authoritarian, we can debate totalitarianism, I think suspension of civil liberties in London and all sorts of things will give us pause. What happens when all this, the ideas, the forms, the tactics, the individuals, are then re-exported back out to empire after the Second World War? And in many ways, that's what this lecture is sought to demonstrate to you. In many ways, that's where I think the answers to my initial questions that I was left with in Kenya. Why the violence? Is Kenya to be accepted? It's that long delay over the 20th century of colonial violence and explaining what it was about this moment, the Second World War, that incubates much of this and then re-exports it back out, which creates a scenario of imperial resurgence after the Second World War that looks vastly different from anything that Professor John Gallagher depicted in his 1974 famous war. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.